Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide. I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Drew Armstrong on the CDC's confirming a second case of the coronavirus here in the United States. Kevin Cirelli from Washington on Democrats making their final push to get witnesses called in President Trump's impeachment trial. And Katie Greifeld on the dimming prospects for ultra-long U.S. bonds. So, Drew, thanks for being here. Give us the latest. We have the CDC confirming two, although we have some word from Capitol Hill. There may be a third on the way.
Yeah, there's a second case that was confirmed in Illinois a little bit earlier today by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And then lawmakers in Capitol Hill just got a closed-door briefing from federal health officials. And coming out of that, several lawmakers mentioned that there was a third case that was expected to be confirmed shortly. We know that federal health officials and state and local folks are monitoring about 60 people. This is mostly folks who've come back from the Wuhan area in China where the outbreak is centered. And they do expect there to be more of these as the days and weeks go on.
How do we gauge the level of concern of the CDC? We know WHO yesterday said it's a Chinese health crisis, not yet a global health crisis.
Yeah, the differentiating factor here right now is, all of the infections so far seem to be happening in China. That makes it a regional case. People who are coming back to the States and being diagnosed, they got infected there. You don't see people in the U.S. infecting other folks in the U.S., meaning you've got a reservoir of disease here and its own kind of self-perpetuating thing. I think that's the difference between this being a China issue that has some tentacles out to the rest of the world and a truly global outbreak.
It's fairly early going so far, but what is the treatment? If someone has it, what do you do?
Right now, most of these patients that we've heard from, certainly in the U.S., are mostly being monitored. Everybody's being described as stable. The symptoms resemble, a flu or a cold. It is being described as pneumonia-like. It is a severe respiratory infection. So, as far as we know, a lot of the treatments are going to be similar to that. Right now, there is not a vaccine. There is not a medicine that is approved to attack this specifically. So, most of the care is likely to be supportive in nature.
Okay, thank you so much to Drew Armstrong. Always good to hear from him on health issues. Now we're going to go to Kevin Cirelli. We like to hear from him on impeachment. He's down in Washington. So the final day, the third day for the Democrats, what do we expect? They really want to get these witnesses called. Do they have a chance?
No. Look, I'm going to be really, really candid here. Republican strategists that I talk with who have been working on the impeachment issue and working with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell have all independently told me that it is increasingly unlikely that they would be able to do that. Now, that, of course, could change if there were to be a last-minute twist in this. But again, the process that Leader McConnell has orchestrated here would increasingly look like that would be unlikely. I can also tell you that the anticipation from the White House is that this trial will likely be wrapped up by the president's State of the Union address on February 4th. Meanwhile, Democrats pushing forcefully here. Day three, as you mentioned, David, in terms of their arguments to remove President Trump from office. The president, for his part, tweeting out earlier today that he's disappointed that the Republicans are going to have to make their case on Saturday morning, which, according to the president, is not the best primetime television viewing hours. David.
And in the meantime, the president's business continues as usual, at least political business. He's got a big rally he's going to appear for the first president ever today.
I was struck by this. He's got a massive rally planned for today. He's going to attend the March for Life. This is the first time that a president has done this. I was traveling, of course, all week with the Secretary of State. The secretary also mentioning that in a speech that he gave in Sumner, Florida, inland Florida, another conservative base that they're trying to win in the state of Florida. So this is something that is really going to be positioned for the base. We should also note the president making news to our very own Jordan Fabian, who asked him on a flight gaggle, as it's known, about a Middle East peace plan that is anticipated, according to the president, to come out sometime before the Israelis come visit the White House next week.
Yeah, exactly. We have our calendars circled for that possible Mideast peace plan at long last. Yeah. So thanks so much to Kevin Cirelli. And by the way, welcome back to Washington after that triumphant tour of Latin America. And now we're going to turn to Katie Greifeld right here in New York, because Secretary of Treasury Mnuchin made some news over in Davos about the 20-year bond and the ultra-long bond. What's the significance of all this, Katie?
Well, the interesting thing for bond traders in this news that Bloomberg broke was that this will slightly extend the maturity of the outstanding Treasury debt. And that's interesting because that probably means that Treasury isn't going to adjust the sizes of the auctions too much. The weighted average maturity, they're not really paying that much attention to it. So the thinking was that perhaps, they'd issue more shorter-term debt to sort of keep maturity and duration stable. But with these comments, it's clear that they're not going to try to tinker around with auction sizes too much.
Exactly. And the real question I guess I have is, what does that do, all the things being equal, to the yield curve? when you change the adjustment of the maturities that you're issuing?
Right. Well, duration is scary in some senses because it's basically sensitivity to interest rate moves, which means if yields spike, or bonds with longer duration could be open to more losses. So Mnuchin didn't say by how much this would alter the duration, but he said it wouldn't be that dramatic of an increase. So that, we're not going to see it dramatically expand and open up, bondholders to too much losses here.
Yeah, but bond traders tend to be sensitive about these things. We want to follow. Okay, thank you so much to Katie Greifeld for that report. And now let's check on how the markets are doing today in reactions to today's top stories. Joining us now is Kayla Line. So it looks a bit risk off, and I wonder if it has to do with Drew Armstrong's report on coronavirus.
Well, in part, it definitely does. I mean, you have to consider that when we came into the open this morning, we were higher, near record highs, and we have really sharply sold off as the confirmed cases in the U.S. of 2, possibly 3 of these viruses. The S&P 500 right now is down by about 0.6%. Actually, this could be the worst day for the S&P in about 3 weeks since January 3rd. You even have seen the NASDAQ flip into the red, which also was seeing some sustained strength earlier. And while investors are coming out of stocks, they're rushing into those safer haven assets. The 10-year yield is now back below 170. We're down 4 basis points today.
Wow. And so if it's not coronavirus, what could be contributing to this beyond coronavirus?
I mean, beyond that, you did have a disappointing manufacturing PMI this morning, 945. That number came in just slightly below estimates. So I think that started more of the risk-off tone. That's when we started to see the S&P 500 decline, but it really has accelerated as these reports of the virus has circulated. And you're seeing that underneath the surface of the market, too, when you look at specific industry groups like travel stocks. The likes of United and American Airlines, cruise stocks are all down by roughly 4% today, as are some of those online travel agencies, the likes of Trip.com, TripAdvisor, et cetera, are lower today, as well as some of the casino stocks that are exposed to Macau, for example. So you're seeing this really percolate through the market, and it's a really red day for those exposed to China.
Looks like a weak Friday as of now. We got a little ways to go, but as of now. Okay, thanks so much to Katie Lyons for that market report. And now we're going to turn to Mark Crumpton. He's here with Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. Following up on the coronavirus story, U.S. health officials are about to confirm a 3rd case of the Wuhan virus in the United States. That's according to 3 senators speaking to reporters in Washington. Earlier today, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention confirmed a 2nd case in the United States, saying a Chicago woman in her 60s is infected. Last month, she visited Wuhan, the Chinese city at the center of the outbreak. Officials are monitoring more than 60 people in 22 states. The virus has killed at least 25 people in China and sickened more than 800. Democratic impeachment managers have one more day to convince Senate Republicans they want to subpoena witnesses and documents to help make their case against President Trump. To do that, they'll need at least 4 Republicans to vote with the 47 Democrats. The president's lawyers begin their arguments tomorrow. The European Union says more time is needed to unravel a dispute between countries involved in the Iran nuclear agreement. Last week, Britain, France, and Germany triggered the accord's dispute resolution mechanism to force Iran into talks on possible violations of the 2015 deal. If no solution is found, it could result in new sanctions on Iran. Yemen's government wants to resume direct peace talks with Iranian-backed Houthi rebels to end a brutal 5-year conflict. That's according to the country's U.S. envoy, who says getting the insurgents back to the negotiating table will require both military pressure and international diplomacy. The 5 years of fighting has created what the United Nations has called the world's worst humanitarian disaster. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, President Trump is about to speak at the March for Life in Washington, becoming the first U.S. president ever to do so. We'll discuss how important social issues will be in the upcoming election with our panel. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
This country, city, and county. Oh Lord, every city and town from famine, disease.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Today is the 47th annual March for Life in Washington. It's a pro-life event that's timed for the anniversary of Roe against Wade, and it attracts anti-abortion advocates from around the country. No U.S. president has ever appeared at this rally, that is, until today, with President Trump scheduled to speak there momentarily. We go now to Washington to our political panel of Rachel Bovard. She is Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, and John Zogby, founder and senior partner of John Zogby Strategy. So welcome, both of you. So let me talk about social issues in this election, because thus far we've been sort of focused on the Democrats. The Democrats don't seem to be disagreeing with each other on things like abortion. At the same time, does President Trump really need to shore this up? Rachel, I'll ask you that. Doesn't he have that pretty solid with his base?
He does, but I think this is an incredibly important moment for him because, you know, evangelicals, conservative Catholics, the religious community took a gamble on him, particularly on this social conservative issue on pro-life, and he is now the first president ever to go to the March for Life. I really think shoring up a lot of the accomplishments that he's gotten for this community, he has been above and away the most pro-life president that we've had. Things like getting Planned Parenthood to defund themselves, putting restrictions, allowing states to restrict Medicaid funding to abortion providers, reinstituting guidance saying that babies born alive after an abortion get care. All these things have been on the agenda for social conservatives, and he's locked them down in addition to appointing a host of conservative jurists. And so I think, you know, this is an important constituency for him, and they're extremely excited to see him today. So
John Zogby, from the Democrat side, what about the constituency in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, that people think will really be critical states? To what extent will the votes there, the critical votes the president needs, be driven by things such as abortion?
You know, to a large degree, they will. You know, the question we always ask in these battleground states is, you know, among blue-collar voters, swing voters in particular, they're going to vote on the economy or are they going to vote on values? They tend to be a bit more conservative on values. This president is making a clear and unequivocal statement about where he stands. And from his vantage point politically, what he's doing is he is solidifying that base, perhaps more than any other president has, by coming out today. He runs the risk, however, of shoring up the Democratic base on the opposite end by taking such a strong stand. And that in itself makes abortion and some of these other gay rights and some of these other conservative issues the ultimate wedge issue. And now, where do swing voters in Wisconsin, Michigan land? Right. That's you know, that's where the other issues come in.
Rachel, as you see the politics of it, is there any risk at all of the president going too far on this issue? And let me talk specifically about suburban women. There's been some reporting, including in some recent elections, that maybe even in some red state, there's been some defection from suburban women on some of the social values issues. Is there any danger that he actually could alienate some of the people he needs?
Well, I think when you look at what the polling shows, most Americans actually support restrictions on late-term abortions. And I think, you know, President Trump has really responded to, I think, the increasing extremism of Democrats on this issue. I mean, you had a governor of a state say that it was okay to for a baby born after a botched abortion to not receive medical care. That's extreme. That's infanticide. And that has galvanized. I don't think the left realizes how that has galvanized social conservatives on this issue. And so, you know, I think a lot of what he's proposing is pretty simple. A lot of it has been religious freedom, conscience protections, simply saying, you know, late-term abortions aren't going to happen, and allowing people to make choices. And so when you look at his agenda on this issue, it hasn't been that extreme, and I think it's in line with a lot of the polling, which shows across the country, people are more or less in the middle. They support restrictions on late-term abortions after 3 months, and that's a lot of what President Trump has been focused on.
So John, pick up on that, what Rachel just said about people tend to be somewhere in the middle, that they don't want anybody to have an abortion whenever they want. On the other hand, they are in favor of some restrictions on it. Is there anybody on the Democratic side running for president, any of the candidates, who may triangulate a little bit here and say, look, I am for abortion, but I'm against some of the extreme things, actually, that Rachel just talked about?
There is not one candidate out there who takes that position at all. And so this is the ultimate wedge issue here, and this is why we're talking about it today. Because for every solid Republican and conservative that the president brings into his corner, he is also alienating a possible swing or soft liberal supporter. Remember, we're at about 50% now of all voters who say that they will never vote for Donald Trump. Democrats' problem is that they need to be sure that these folks come out and vote for whoever the Democratic nominee is. And an issue like this, taking such a strong and actually one-sided view on abortion, could actually help bring some of those voters out.
Rachel Bovard,
well, can I just add?
Sorry, please. Yes,
yeah,
please.
Can I just add, to the point that no Democrat takes the position of infanticide, increasingly the progressive base has pushed them to take that position. Just last year, there was a vote in the Senate on the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, which simply said if a baby's born alive after a botched abortion, they deserve medical care. All 44 Senate Democrats voted against that. So they are now on record not supporting care for an aborted infant that manages to survive. So I do think increasingly the progressive base is pulling the Democratic Party to the left on this issue, and Trump and I think a lot of Republicans are responding to it.
We're talking with Rachel Bovard and John Zogby, our political panel here. So, Rachel, I want to come back on what President Trump has done on this issue, and I think that many Republicans say one of the things he's done is Supreme Court nominations, putting people on the Supreme Court. We have a big abortion case up there in the court. They're in the middle of the term right now. Could this entire landscape change depending on how that comes out? We did, after all, have a lot of Republicans assume that when it came to Obamacare, the court would go a certain way, and we had Chief Justice Roberts go the other way. Could it change between now and November?
Yeah, one thing I've learned, you don't ever want to predict the Supreme Court. It can go either way. But this abortion case is important. It's not as big of a sea change, I think, as everyone's making it out to be. It's just about whether or not doctors should have admitting privileges. Abortion doctors should have admitting privileges at local hospitals. But it is going to be a seminal case because the Supreme Court doesn't often take these cases. But I do think, going back to this base for President Trump, this is why a lot of evangelicals, conservative Catholics came to the polls for him, is because they knew he would put conservative justices in place on the Supreme Court, because more and more frequently, because Congress fails to do its job, these policy issues are being litigated in the courts. And so those appointments matter more than they ever have before. And Trump has delivered on all these issues for his base.
John Zogby, let's spend a minute or two at least here on impeachment. There's an impeachment trial going on, after all, up on the Capitol Hill. A pretty historic event, although a lot of people are not paying too much attention to it. Is there any prospect at this point that, in fact, they'll get those 4 Republican senators to vote to call witnesses?
No, they're trying awfully hard to do it, but no, there is really no chance. In particular, you had some very strong statements by Jerry Nadler and Adam Schiff that were deemed by some of these specific moderate Republicans to be insulting. That's not the way to win friends and influence people. I mean, bottom line here, Democrats are trying very hard to make a point. That point has been made over and over and over and over again. This issue is, president's not going to be removed from office, even though the polls float back and forth, 48% removed, 51% removed. The thing is, you're not going to remove a president of the United States who's got support in the mid-40 percentile. Remember, to get Nixon out of office all those years ago, his numbers went down to 23%, and it became a political liability. President is not viewed as a political liability by these Republicans yet.
Rachel Bovard, final thought. Come November, is this impeachment, however it comes out, and we think we know it's going to come out, is it going to factor at all in the election?
I think Democrats desperately want it to, but I don't think it's going to come out that way. I think people have made up their minds already. They are where they are. This impeachment trial isn't changing their minds. And in fact, it's turning a lot of independents off. So at the end of the day, he's going to be acquitted. I don't think it's going to weigh too strongly in the final outcome in 2020.
Okay, it looks like it's going to happen reasonably quickly. Okay, many thanks to our political panel now of Rachel Bovard and John Zogby. And you can watch and listen to the president's speech at the March for Life on the Bloomberg using the function Live Go. Still ahead here, Disney is our company in the crosshairs as the coronavirus forces the company to shut down its theme park in Shanghai. Details on that next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Earlier on Bloomberg television, there was a report about former Theranos CEO Elizabeth Holmes' defense in a civil case. Our reporter mentioned the company's relationship with Walmart. She misspoke and was referring to Theranos' relationship with Walgreens for an on-site blood test. We apologize for that error. It's time now for the stock of the hour. Disney is lower by more than 1% today after the company announced it will close its Shanghai park beginning tomorrow due to fears about the coronavirus. Kaylee Lyons is here with more. So I hesitated a moment because last time I looked it was down 0.5%. Now it's down 1.5%.
The declines are accelerating, although I should say for the broader market, the declines are steepening. So it's probably part of that larger sell-off. But for Disney, it's actually down more than 3% on the week amid concerns about the virus. News today is that they're going to close the Shanghai park beginning tomorrow, really because they say they need to ensure the safety of not only visitors, but their performers. They will open it at an unknown time. They're going to stay in close contact with the government. And I would note that their Shanghai park they have a minority stake. Disney only owns about 43% of it. The other 57% is the Chinese government. So they may have a hand in this decision as well. We know the government is taking increasing action to stop the spread of this virus. But some of those actions include the delay or cancellation of movie openings, people closing movie theaters. That could affect Disney as well. It's not just parks revenue, but that studio and entertainment revenue at risk as well.
You anticipated, because I was going to say that is not the only investment Disney's made in China. They have Hong Kong that they have minority interests as well.
Right.
And they've really made a big push on consumer goods, on movies, on all sorts of entertainment and things like that. So Disney has really put a big bet on China.
It absolutely has. I mean, Asia as a market in general makes up about 11% of the company's revenue now. And you speak about Hong Kong. I mean, that park has had some struggles as well. It saw in the last quarter a big hit because of the protests in Hong Kong. And so now you're seeing two Asian parks potentially that have weakness in revenue and in visitors, especially when you consider this is all happening during that Lunar New Year period where a lot of people and families are traveling, and they may not be doing that anymore.
But that's not the only thing Disney's doing these days. I mean, they have Disney Plus too, which is just way outperforming what the projections were.
It really is. I mean, you even had an analyst over at Morgan Stanley, despite all of these fears about the virus, lifting his price target on Disney today because of the strength of Disney Plus, saying that it's just scaling so much faster than could be anticipated, really showing strength and it's taking hold. And if there is a bright side to look at the coronavirus through the Disney lens, not to say that it isn't obviously a horrible thing going on in China, but you have had chatter in the market that may be a boost to streaming, because instead of families over the holiday period going out to movie theaters, they may be staying at home and binge watching Disney Plus or Netflix. We've seen Netflix up about 8% over the course of the past 2 days on that exact idea.
And Disney Plus, as you say, is doing really, really well, much better than what they said they thought they were going to do. At the same time, you already mentioned Netflix. You also have Amazon, and then you've got others coming in. You've got HBO, plus you've got a lot of other things coming in. It's going to be a really crowded area pretty soon.
There is a lot of competition, but analysts seem to be pretty optimistic on Disney Plus's odds that it's going to be able to withstand that.
Kaylee, thanks so much. That's Kaylee Lyons with her report on the market. Up next, Jennifer Hillman, former member of the WTO appellate body and now with the Council on Foreign Relations, joins us to discuss efforts to reform the WTO and whether they will work. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, ABC News is reporting that it has a recording that appears to show President Trump saying he wanted Marie Yovanovitch removed as ambassador to Ukraine. Although ABC did not provide audio, the network says on the tape, a voice that appears to be Mr. Trump says, quote, "Get rid of her, get her out tomorrow," end quote. If accurate, the recording backs up testimony in the House impeachment hearings that the president had Yovanovitch removed because she was viewed as an obstacle to his efforts to press Ukraine into investigating Democrat Joe Biden and his son. The impeachment trial continues about half an hour from now. House Democrats have one more day to present their case. As we've been reporting, the president is set to become the first U.S. president to speak in person to anti-abortion protesters at the March for Life rally. The event in Washington is held every year and is getting underway at this hour. It marks the Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision in 1973 that protected the right to an abortion. The president spoke to the rally by satellite previously. London police say they'll start using live facial recognition cameras to catch criminals. It's an effort that human rights groups call, quote, a dangerous and sinister step. The technology looks for faces in crowds to see if they are a match on any watch lists for serious crimes. Metropolitan Police say it will only be used in specific parts of the city where offenders are most likely to be caught. Turkish President Recep Erdogan wants other countries in the Mediterranean region to put pressure on Libyan forces to abide by a tentative truce. President Erdogan spoke at the opening ceremony of a Turkish-German university's new campus with German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Talks between Erdogan and Merkel were expected to also focus on the future of migration, a deal there between Turkey and the European Union. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
We're talking about a whole new structure for the deal, or we'll have to do something. But the World Trade Organization's been very unfair to the United States for many, many years.
That was President Trump speaking at Davos on Wednesday of this week. Joining us now from Washington is Jennifer Hillman, Senior Fellow for Trade and International Political Economy at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's also a former member of the WTO appellate body. So welcome, Jennifer. Great to have you with us. First, let's pick up on what President Trump said about reform of WTO. He appeared with the head of the WTO, Roberto Azevedo. What are the reforms that need to be done, and can they get done?
Well, again, I think it's great news that they're at least talking to one another, and that the president is appearing to get a little bit more engaged in what's going on at the WTO. But we have to understand that we're starting from a fairly bad place in that the United States has blocked the appointment of any members to sit on what is the functional equivalent of the WTO Supreme Court, its appellate body, so that as of December of last year, the WTO appellate body could no longer function. And what that really means is that if countries are found to be violating the trade rules, they can get out from under those obligations just by filing a notice of appeal to a non-existent appellate body. So we're starting from a place in which the United States has done a very good job of burning the house down without really saying anything about how it is that we're going to build it back up again. So the fact that there was this meeting and that the president at least appears to be ready to get engaged in what do we need to do to reform the WTO is at least good news, or better than we've been. I think that reforms have to come on both sides of the house. In other words, there has to be reforms and improvement to this dispute settlement mechanism so that the rules themselves are binding on countries. But secondly, there has to be reforms that will allow the WTO to reach new agreements more readily. The negotiating function of the WTO is the other place that you really are going to need to see reforms.
So give us a précis, if you would, on 2020 in terms of trade. I mean, certainly last year, 2019, there was an awful lot of U.S.-China. Now we have a phase one agreement. They say they're going to go to phase two. If I give you a choice, and you may have another choice that I'm not giving you, U.S.-China on the one hand, USMCA is basically taken care of, it appears, North America. Europe, the president in that same news conference said we're really going after Europe. And then we have U.S.-UK, where we have an announcement that just came out that Boris Johnson apparently has signed the EU withdrawal agreement, which may free him up to negotiate with us. What are going to be the biggest trade issues this year?
So again, I think basically all three of them, and I think you're exactly right, because the context of all of this is occurring. There's been a whole lot of unilateral and bilateral activity by the United States, much of it, if you will, in violation of the WTO rules. So it begs the question of whether we are now moving in a direction of managed trade, bilateral trade, mini deals, or whether we still are interested in the bigger, broader WTO multilateral rules. And I think the honest answer is we're going to have to do both. So specifically on the U.S.-UK side, I think it's very interesting that the Secretary Mnuchin said they think we're going to get a U.S.-UK agreement by the end of this year. For what it's worth, I think it's pretty unrealistic. Why? Because most U.S. companies are going to want to know first what's the relationship between Europe and the United Kingdom. Because an awful lot of what U.S. companies do when they invest in the U.K., what they really want is access to the European market in addition to take Ford as a company that's doing a lot of business in the U.K. Single largest brand of cars sold in the United Kingdom right now is a Ford car. But Ford is in the UK in large part in order to sell cars into the rest of Europe. Right now, Ford can do that duty-free, tariff-free, and regulatory-free. Once Brexit happens, if there is no agreement between the UK and the EU, now all of a sudden Ford's got to pay 10% duty on every car moving across the channel, and it has to have its car re-inspected. So how interested is Ford in a US-UK agreement is going to really depend on whether or not what is the relationship between the EU and the UK. So I'm not sure that it's realistic to think that we're going to get a US-UK agreement until and unless there's something worked out with the EU. Troubling is, I think, the potential for a major trade war with the European Union. Again, by way of context, if you look at it, we already have tariffs on the European Union steel and aluminum, and Europe has retaliated against those. So Europe has tariffs on us. We've just put tariffs on olives, wine, cheese, a whole lot of things, up to the tune of $7.5 billion because Europe was found to violate its WTO obligations as a result of subsidies to Airbus. Coming soon this year is going to be a ruling that will allow Europe to retaliate against the United States because of our subsidies to Boeing. And over all of this is the threat of maybe we're going to have tariffs on autos under this national security investigation. So I think clearly looming is major trade tensions with the European Union. In the background is potentially some kind of an agreement with the UK. And over all of it is the real need to figure out how do we get the multilateral, the bigger, broader base set of rules going at the WTO.
We're talking with Jennifer Hillman from the Council on Foreign Relations. Sort of as a final note here, what role does agriculture play in this with respect to Europe and potentially with respect to the UK as well? That's something that apparently was addressed in the Phase 1 agreement with a commitment to buy more products. As we know, agriculture is very sensitive in both Europe and in the UK.
Right. And here again, you're looking right at a huge dilemma. So the beginning of this idea of a US-EU agreement came about in a meeting between President Juncker of the European Union and President Trump last year. And the parameters of that on paper are that the agreement will cover only industrial goods, not agriculture. So the European Union says we never agreed to put agriculture on the table. And on the other hand, obviously from the United States side, the view is, we don't want to do an agreement unless and until it covers agriculture. So even the scope of what an agreement between the United States and the European Union would be is still very much up for grabs and a lot of recriminations back and forth. But I think for many in America, the key market access that they really want into Europe is in the agriculture area.
Okay, Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us today. That's Jennifer Hillman. She's Senior Fellow for Trade and International Political Economy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Coming up here, the CDC has announced a new case of that deadly China virus in the United States. We'll get more on the medical response with Dr. Chen of Yale University. That's next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. U.S. health officials are about to confirm a third case of the Wuhan virus in the United States. That's according to 3 senators speaking to reporters in Washington. This comes as officials in China have now essentially put 40 million of its citizens on lockdown, and it's ordered travel agencies to stop selling tour packages. Welcome now Dr. Chen. He is Yale University Assistant Professor of Public Health. So welcome, Dr. Chen. It's good to have you with us. Start with the medical science on this. What do we know about this virus?
This virus is highly infectious and already been affecting hundreds of people, and a lot of cases are not confirmed yet. And China already have been shutting down transportation for 8 cities, the size of a population equivalent to the Canada. So this is a very big issue, especially in the timing of this Spring Festival, which affect not only China but the region, because many countries celebrate this holiday. And also it's located in the central city of China, Wuhan, so can reach to many other regions in the world. So it has a tremendous effect. And the worst news is that we still don't know the origin of this pathogen. And we don't know how it is transmitted and how far, how quickly it can get from person to person. So those are the key questions.
You said it's very infectious. How fatal is it? I mean, obviously some people have died. I think last time I saw it was something like 25 people. That's very, very serious. But it doesn't have the same rate of mortality as some other viruses that we've encountered.
Yeah, indeed. This is a large uncertainty how deadly it could be compared to SARS or MERS 10 years ago. So the issue, there are two issues. One, current death rate, the number of deaths is still low. So statistically, it may not be very meaningful to judge at this moment. And also, the confirmation of the deaths is really determined by the capacity of the local health care system. So as I heard, the local hospitals facilities already being overstretched and overcrowded. So that affects their progress in identify people confirmed deaths as a result of this virus. So this number can be highly underestimated, since we have no idea about any closer to the real number.
We've seen various Chinese officials checking people across the country to try to detect whether they have it or not. How detectable is it? Because we've also heard some reports that maybe somebody can have it and not even have a fever, for example.
Yeah, that's very person by person, very much. According to some of the symptoms, some people's description, they do not develop any symptom until the 2 days before the death, and they even have normal temperature. So it's very hard to distinguish, and also it's hard to distinguish from the common cold or flu, because this year the flu season is also lasting very long and hurt a lot of people. So it's hard to distinguish these two. And the fundamental issue is the overstretched hospital system due to the overinvestment in hospital system in the last couple of years in China's health reform, which puts the primary care, the gatekeeper of this health system, at the weak position. So they are not able to attract more patients who have mild symptoms. So they should not go to the hospital, because 90% of them may only have the flu or may only have a cold. But since they are not distinguishable, and due to the social media effect, they have fear, they have panic, so they choose to go. So that's the major issue compared to like 17 years ago when SARS outbroke. The social media was not that prevalent, so which caused less fear and panic at that time compared to today. So we are in a very different world today.
We're talking with Dr. Chen of the Yale Public Health School. So Dr. Chen, you said we don't know enough yet about the origins and the transmission. Are we confident it originated in Wuhan? And is there any indication, because I've heard, again, some reports of this, it might have started in, they have a live animal market there.
Yes, they are called the seafood market, but actually the seafood market sell overwhelmingly more wild animals compared to the seafood. And there are all kinds of wild animals they sell, including the snakes, the civet cats, the raccoon dogs, and all kinds of these things. So that's why in the scientific community, people saying that this was due to the snake, but 1 day later they changed their mind, saying that it could be due to civet dog, and today they also changed. So there's no confirmed source of the infection. And the source of infection is so important. If it is widely spread, kind of wild animals, that means the infection rate and the scale of this infection could be even higher, depending on the origin of this virus.
Dr. Chen, what do we know so far about the Chinese government reaction to this? There was some criticism back when SARS happened. You referred to that earlier. Does the Chinese government appear to have learned a great deal from that experience and improved their response?
Indeed, I believe so, especially in the central government. They acted very swiftly by sharing the gene sequence of the pathogen. And they also waived all the fees for the healthcare. Because in China it was out-of-pocket model. People have to pay upfront in order to get treated. But now for this disease, they do not need to pay anything. And China already categorized this to be grade A infectious disease. So there's a travel ban, the mandatory travel ban for all patients, and people in close contact with them are also in the travel ban. So that's why it's more effective. But the local officials still may have something to improve, because they share their news about human-to-human transmission, the possibility. They shared like much later. They delayed the message being sending to the public. So I think that's the major things to be blamed.
Yeah. Dr. Chen, do we have public health experts, such as yourself, in labs around the world right now working on this?
Yes, in Yale School of Public Health, we just put together a news article about the frequently asked and unanswered questions about the source, the transmission, how to avoid, and how to prevent and control this disease. So it's on the web page of our school website, Yale School of Public Health. And we have more colleagues in this field across the United States. Johns Hopkins University, Harvard, many other institutions are working very closely monitoring this. And even today, the Lancet, the journal in UK, they published 5 articles about this disease. 2 articles are original article with real detailed data.
Okay, Dr. Shi Chen, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. We're going to have more with Dr. Chen coming up in the next hour on Bloomberg Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Bloomberg Radio, coming to you from New York. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Much of the talk at Davos this week was about climate change. So in this week's episode of Bloomberg Wall Street Week, we sat down with former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, TIAA CEO Roger Ferguson, and JetBlue's head of sustainability, she's Sophia Mendelson, to consider what could actually be done, particularly in the airline industry, beyond merely talking about it all.
Each airline flies their plane differently. What we're doing is taking care of the carbon on the customer's behalf without asking the customer to make a sacrifice. We're not saying squeeze your knees in or give up first class. We're saying flying needs to happen. You need to be on our aircraft, and that creates carbon emissions, which we need to take care of as a cost of doing business.
So how about the speed at which you fly the planes?
So flying slower does in some cases save fuel. A much more business-friendly, customer-savvy way to do it is to buy new aircraft, much like JetBlue has. The new aircraft are increasingly fuel efficient.
So can we talk a bit more about that? So technology, I'm hearing ultimately the answer is going to be technology driving down the need to consume fossil fuels while we're waiting for better, sort of green fuels. What are you seeing when you talk to the providers of jet engines that is helping us give you some sense of confidence this is going to get better and better over time?
Yeah, aviation is a bright spot in this. We're not waiting for the technology. The technology is here. The new aircraft are more fuel efficient. We've already made investments in new electric aircraft companies. The carbon offsets are happening now. That's today. That's carbon being avoided and sucked out of the environment today. Sustainable aviation fuel already exists. It's already safe. We need more of it. We need economies of scale. That's an economics problem, not a technology problem.
Sophia, one piece of technology the airlines can't fix on their own is air traffic control.
That's true.
If we were to really revamp, which I understand we need to do, it's obsolete. If we were tomorrow to revamp our air traffic control system, how much would it save in terms of carbon?
It would be significant, and it would not just save carbon, it would save time, it would save money. This is a really good example of the intersection of business and government. The global climate crisis is so big, it's affecting us so quickly. There is no corner of the economy that hasn't already been affected, that isn't going to be potentially crippled by it. Everyone needs to be coming with part of the solution.
Can I tell you a story? When I entered the government, and we were in the beginning, in 2009, the government was thinking about its priorities. I had a meeting as the head of the President's National Economic Council with the CEOs of, then there were half a dozen or more airlines, and they all told me we needed to work on the air traffic control system. And they had a plan, and it was called Next Gen. And the thing about the plan was it was going to take a whole generation
30
to
years.
implement. And I said, if we did this according to your plan, when would we have a modern air traffic control system? This was in 2009. And they said 2035.
Wow.
And I said to them, that's really very interesting, and I appreciate it. And I know this is a really big, complicated problem. But World War II was a really big and complicated war. And it took 3.5 years from the time we entered till the time we won, with 12 million people under arms. So why was it going to take us a quarter century to get a better air traffic control system.
Right.
Has any progress really been made on that?
Yeah, there's been progress made, and I will say, it's not the job of CEOs. No one's ever made money just waiting on congressional action, betting on what congressional action might or might not do. So what we need to do as airlines, as the people running the companies today, is find the solutions that we can work on today, like carbon offsets, like sustainable aviation fuel.
So how about airlines contributing? How about airlines contributing to an infrastructure that would enable them to save fuel costs by not spending as much time circling, that would enable the scarce landing slots to be used? Don't you think the airline industry should be willing to contribute to the air traffic control system we need?
Yeah,
really?
Absolutely. We have next-gen equipment on our aircraft. That aircraft needs to talk to other parts of the system. Government does need to build out some of that. And every time we land a plane, every time we fly a plane, there's so much going on. There's so many ways that we can be reducing those emissions. And what we're really looking for is the ways that affect the customer today, because this is a customer-driven revolution.
You can see more of our discussion on Wall Street Week airing tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and on radio. It's also available on YouTube, Bloomberg.com, and on the terminal. And as climate change becomes a defining issue of our time, Bloomberg has launched Bloomberg Green, which uses data and in-depth reporting to illustrate the scale of the challenge. Find that on the terminal, online, and here on Bloomberg Television and radio. Coming up, Balance of Power continues over on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to have more on the coronavirus with Dr. Chen of the Yale School of Public Health. Live from New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.